February 3rd, 2019. It was Super Bowl Sunday. Across America, millions of families were gathering around their televisions. They were cheering. They were eating. They were celebrating the biggest game of the year. But inside a quiet house in the San Fernando Valley, there was no cheering. There was no party. There was only a man alone sitting on his floor, surrounded by the suffocating silence of a life that had lost its meaning. If you looked at him, you might have recognized the face. For 27 years, that face had been a staple in millions of households. He was handsome. He was charming. He was the man who wore the suits, the man who ran the corporate boardrooms of Genoa City. To the world, he was Neil Winters, the unbreakable pillar of the young and the restless. But on this Sunday, the cameras were off. The makeup was gone. And the man on the floor wasn't Neil Winters. He was Kristoff St. And he was drinking himself to death. They say that actors are professional liars. Their job is to wear a mask to make you believe that the drama is only on the screen. Kristoff St. was one of the best. He won 10 NAACP Image Awards. He won 2 Daytime Emmys. He broke racial barriers, showing the world that a black man on a soap opera didn't have to be a thug or a servant. He could be a powerful executive, a loving father, a king. But the cruelest irony of his life was this. The man who played the character that could fix any problem could not save himself from the one thing that was hunting him. When the police broke down the door of his home later that day, they found a scene that would haunt his fans forever. The handsome star was slumped between a couch and a coffee table. Empty bottles of vodka were scattered around him like tombstones. The coroner's report was clinical. It used cold medical terms. They said he died of hypertrophic heart disease. They said it was an accidental alcohol overdose. They said his heart muscle was too thick and it simply gave out. But that is a lie. Or at least it is only half the truth. Kristoff St. didn't die on February 3rd, 2019. That was just when his body finally stopped moving. The truth is, Kristoff died 5 years earlier on a cold November night inside a mental health facility in Long Beach. He died the moment he realized that all his fame, all his money, and all his love could not save his son from a plastic bag and a negligent hospital staff. This is not just a story about a celebrity tragedy. This is not just another actor gone too soon. This is a horror story about the American mental health system. It is a story about the devastating silent war of schizophrenia. And it is a story about a father who stared into the abyss of grief for so long that the abyss finally reached out and pulled him in. In his final moments while he was drunk and fading away, Kristoff called his ex-wife. He didn't speak about fear. He didn't speak about pain. He said something that chills the blood. He told her, "Julian is at the door. He's here to take me for a walk." Julian was his son, and Julian had been dead for 5 years. Was it a hallucination of a dying brain? Or was it a father finally getting the one thing he wanted, more than life itself, a reunion? To understand how we ended up on that floor, with the empty vodka bottles, we have to rewind the tape. We have to strip away the glamour of Hollywood and look at the strange, chaotic, and often disturbing world that built Kristoff St. Because before the fame, before the tragedy, there was a childhood filled with cults, isolation, and a family history that seemed destined for heartbreak. Here is part 2 of 7. Focus the origin story. The God of India and the Shattered Illusion. Word, count 680 words. Part 2. Born into Chaos and the False Prophet. To understand the man who ended his life in despair, we have to look at the boy who started his life in confusion. Kristoff St. John's life was scripted for drama from the moment he took his first breath. He was born in 1966 in New York City, a time when racial tensions in America were at a boiling point. His biological mother was white and Polish. His father, Kristoff St. John, was a black actor and director. In today's world, a mixed-race child is celebrated. But in the 1960s, for some, it was a scandal. Kristoff later revealed a heartbreaking truth: he never really knew his mother because her parents, his own grandparents, refused to accept him. They were immigrants who could not look past the color of his skin. From day one, rejection was woven into his DNA. He was raised primarily by his father and his stepmother, Maria. But this wasn't a traditional household with white picket fences. His parents were artists. They were radicals. They were full-blown hippies living in the counterculture revolution. Imagine a young boy growing up in the isolated mountains of Southern California. While other kids were eating hamburgers and watching cartoons, Kristoff was living on a strict diet of raw vegetables. He was forbidden from eating meat. He was forbidden from consuming the poison of American pop culture. He later told stories of getting beat up at school because he was the weird kid trying to steal other students' lunches just to get a taste of normal food. But the eccentricity of his parents went beyond just diet. It led them into one of the most bizarre and traumatic chapters of his life, a chapter that Kristoff kept hidden for decades. When Kristoff was around 14 years old, his stepmother became fascinated, obsessed really, with a man in India named Sathya Sai Baba. To the uninitiated, Sai Baba was a global phenomenon. He was a guru who claimed to be an avatar of God. He had an afro like Jimi Hendrix and wore flowing orange robes. He had over 50 million followers worldwide. Kings, queens, and even the Beatles visited him. He claimed he could perform miracles, conjuring gold jewelry and holy ash out of thin air. Kristoff's father, being a filmmaker, decided to move the entire family to India to film a documentary about this living God. They thought they were documenting a miracle. Instead, they walked into a horror show. For months, the St. John family lived in the guru's compound. But as the cameras rolled, the illusion began to crack. They didn't find divinity. They found depravity. Kristoff and his family slowly uncovered the dark truth that the world didn't want to hear. Sai Baba wasn't a god. He was allegedly a predator. Later accounts in the documentary Kristoff eventually released, titled "A Man Called God," exposed allegations of sexual abuse and manipulation that rivaled the infamous Jim Jones cult. They realized that behind the miracles and the holy ash was a system of control designed to exploit the vulnerable. Imagine being a teenager taken halfway across the world to worship a man only to realize that the savior is a monster. This experience planted a seed in Kristoff's mind that would grow for the rest of his life. Nothing is what it seems. The people the world worships are often wearing masks. Safety is an illusion. And sometimes, the people who claim to save you are the ones who will hurt you the most. The family escaped the cult and returned to Hollywood disillusioned, but determined. Kristoff channeled that confusion and intensity into the only outlet he knew: acting. He was a natural. He was a child prodigy. By the age of 12, he was playing a young Alex Haley in the legendary miniseries Roots: The Next Generations. He was in the Bad News Bears. He was on The Cosby Show. He was beating out future rock stars like Lenny Kravitz for roles. On the surface, he was the golden child of Black Hollywood. He was building a resume that most adult actors would kill for. But underneath the success, the trauma of his childhood, the rejection, the isolation, The cult was still there, simmering. And as he entered adulthood, he thought he had finally found his safe harbor. He found success on the young and the restless. And more importantly, he found love. He met a fiery, beautiful boxer named Mia St. John. They became a power couple. And when they welcomed their son Julian into the world, Kristoff thought the chaos was finally over. He was wrong. The chaos was just waiting for the next generation. By 1991, Kristoff St. John had left the ghosts of India and the awkwardness of his teenage years behind. He was ready to claim his throne. He walked onto the set of The Young and the Restless and changed the game. Before him, black characters on daytime TV were often tokens. But Kristoff, alongside the dazzling Victoria Rowell, who played Drusilla, created something electric. They became a super couple. They were black love personified, glamorous, complex, and powerful. They rivaled the biggest white couples on the show. For the first time, millions of African American viewers saw themselves represented not as victims, but as icons. The awards started pouring in. The money started flowing. Kristoff wasn't just working, he was winning. He won the Daytime Emmy for Outstanding Younger Actor in 1992. He was on top of the world, and his personal life seemed to mirror his professional success. He met a woman who could match his intensity. Fire for fire, Mia St. John. Mia wasn't your typical Hollywood wife. She was a force of nature. She was a 5-time world champion boxer, a taekwondo black belt, a model, and a businesswoman. Together, they were the picture of success. He was the artist. She was the fighter. They were young, beautiful, and seemingly unstoppable. In 1989, their joy was cemented with the birth of their son, Julian St. John. If Kristoff was the king of daytime, Julian was his prince. Kristoff poured everything into that boy. Perhaps he was trying to give Julian the childhood. He never had a childhood free from isolation, free from cults, and filled with unconditional love. Photos from that era show a father beaming with pride, holding his son like he was the most precious award he had ever won. They later had a daughter, Paris, completing the perfect family portrait. But here is the thing about genetics. It doesn't care about your fame. It doesn't care about your Emmy Awards. It doesn't care how much you love your children. Hidden deep within the St. John bloodline, a silent enemy was waiting. While the cameras were rolling and the red carpet photos were being taken, Kristoff was privately battling his own demons. Few people knew this at the time, but Kristoff himself struggled with bipolar disorder. He was high-functioning, masking his manic highs, and depressive lows with work and charisma. In the black community, and especially in the high-pressure world of Hollywood, you didn't talk about mental illness. You toughed it out. You prayed it away. Or you simply acted through it. Kristoff managed to keep his balance on the tightrope, but he didn't realize that he had passed down more than just his talent and his good looks to his son. As Julian grew from a cute baby into a young man, the perfect life began to fray. Julian was artistic sensitive and deeply intelligent, just like his father. But by the time he hit his teenage years, the shadows started to creep in. It wasn't just teenage rebellion, it was something darker. Julian started hearing things that weren't there. He started seeing things others couldn't see. The bright artistic boy was slowly being pulled into a world of confusion. Kristoff and Mia, who had divorced in 1990 but remained best friends and co-parents, found themselves facing an opponent that Mia couldn't box and Kristoff couldn't charm. They were about to enter a war for their son's mind. And they were about to discover that in the United States of America, having money doesn't guarantee you help. Sometimes it just buys you a front row seat to a tragedy. The nightmare of schizophrenia was waking up. Here is part 4 of 7. Focus, the onset of madness. The stigma and the desperate choice. Word, count 690 words. Part 4. The demons of Julian. Schizophrenia is a thief. It doesn't steal your possessions. It steals your reality. It waits until you are on the cusp of adulthood, usually around the late teens or early 20s, and then it strikes. For Julian, St. John the thief arrived when he was around 17 years old. Up until that point, he was a gentle soul. He was an incredibly gifted artist, whose paintings showed a depth of emotion far beyond his years. But then the paintings started to get darker, and the silence in his room was replaced by voices that only he could hear. Mia St. John described it as watching her son slowly disappear. One day, he was the boy she raised. The next, he was staring at a wall, terrified of invisible enemies. He claimed to be a prophet. He claimed people were chasing him. The wiring in his brilliant brain had short-circuited. But in the early 2000s, especially within the Black and Latino communities, mental illness was a conversation that people avoided, as Mia later said in a heartbreaking interview. In our communities, we deal with mental illness differently. We look at it like, ain't nothing wrong with you, you'll be all right, shake it off. You don't shake off schizophrenia. You don't pray away a chemical imbalance that tells you the government is monitoring your thoughts. Kristoff and Mia were wealthy. They had resources. But they quickly learned that money is useless against a disease that convinces the patient that everyone is the enemy, including the parents trying to save them. To silence the terrifying noise in his head, Julian turned to the only thing that worked instantly: drugs. The media likes to paint drug addicts as criminals or hedonists looking for a party. But for Julian, methamphetamines and opioids weren't about having fun. They were about survival. They were a mute button for the screaming voices in his mind. It was self-medication in its most tragic form. The golden boy of Hollywood descended into a living hell. Julian would disappear for days. There were times when he chose homelessness over the comfort of his father's mansion, because the streets felt safer than the spies in his house. There were arrests. There were DUIs. There were desperate rehab attempts. Kristoff St. John was living a double life. By day, he was Neil Winters, the composed executive on The Young and the Restless. By night, he was a terrified father, driving through the dangerous streets of Los Angeles, searching under bridges and in alleyways, looking for his son. Can you imagine the agony? Knowing your child is out there, cold, hallucinating, and vulnerable, while you have to smile for the cameras and pretend everything is fine. By 2014, the situation had become critical. Julian wasn't just a danger to himself. He was losing his will to live. He had attempted suicide before. He had run into traffic. He had tried to inhale carbon dioxide. Kristoff and Mia had to make the hardest decision a parent can make. They realized they couldn't keep him safe at home anymore. They needed professionals. They needed a secure environment where he could be watched 24/7, medicated, and stabilized. They found a place called La Casa Mental Health Rehabilitation Center in Long Beach, California. On paper, it looked like a sanctuary. It was a medical facility designed to handle severe cases like Julian's. The doctors promised Kristoff and Mia that their son would be safe. They promised he would be on suicide watch. They promised that staff would check on him every 15 minutes, ensuring he couldn't harm himself. Kristoff exhaled. He thought, finally, he is safe. He is in a hospital. Nothing can happen to him there. He dropped his son off, trusting the system. He trusted the doctors. He trusted the white coats. He didn't know that he had just delivered his son into a death trap. The tragedy of Julian St. John isn't just that he was sick. It's that he asked for help. His parents paid for help, and the very people paid to protect him decided to look the other way. November 23, 2014. It is a date etched in acid on the soul of the St. John family. 3 weeks earlier, Kristoff and Mia had placed their 24-year-old son Julian into the care of the La Casa Mental Health Rehabilitation Center. They didn't do it because they wanted to get rid of him. They did it because they loved him. They were terrified that if he stayed on the streets or even at home, he would hurt himself. The facility had one job: keep him alive. Julian was categorized as a high-risk patient. That designation comes with strict protocols. He was supposed to be on constant suicide watch. The staff was legally required to visually check on him every 15 minutes, not every hour. Every 15 minutes. They were supposed to remove any dangerous objects from his possession: shoelaces, belts, sharp objects, and certainly plastic bags. But on that Sunday afternoon, the system didn't just fail. It stopped working entirely. Julian called his mother earlier that day. He sounded agitated. He sounded like the voices were winning. Mia called the nurses' station. She begged them to check on him. She told them he sounded off. They assured her, "Don't worry, Mrs. St. John. We are watching him." They were lying. At around 1 p.m., Julian St. John was found unresponsive in the bathroom of his room. He had placed a plastic bag over his head. When the call came to Kristoff, the world stopped spinning. The silence on the other end of the line was the sound of a universe collapsing. His beautiful boy, the artist, the prince, was gone. But grief quickly turned to a white-hot rage when the details of the death began to surface. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a crime scene of negligence. Kristoff and Mia hired lawyers. They demanded answers. And what they found in the investigation was enough to make your stomach turn. First, the weapon. How does a patient on high-risk suicide watch get a plastic bag? In a mental health ward, a plastic bag is as dangerous as a loaded gun. The investigation revealed that the facility had been lax about contraband. Julian had not only obtained the bag, but previous reports showed he had been accessing alcohol and cigarettes inside the facility. The security was a joke. But the smoking gun was the surveillance footage. The facility's records, the official logs written by the nurses and staff, stated clearly, "Patient checked at 12:15. Patient checked at 12:30. Patient checked at 12:45. On paper, they did their job perfectly. But the video cameras told a different story. The footage showed that for nearly an hour leading up to his death, no one looked in Julian's room. No one opened the door. No one checked to see if he was breathing. The staff had allegedly sat at their station ignoring the patient, and then falsified the medical records to cover their tracks. They wrote down checks that never happened. While they were forging signatures, Julian was dying alone, just feet away from them. Kristoff St. John was destroyed. It is one thing to lose a child to a disease like cancer, where you know the doctors did everything they could. It is an entirely different kind of hell to know that your child died because someone couldn't be bothered to get up from their chair. Kristoff and Mia filed a wrongful death lawsuit. They accused the facility of widespread negligence. They fought not just for money, but for the truth. They eventually reached a settlement, but no amount of money can bring a dead child back. In the aftermath, Kristoff changed. The light in his eyes, the spark that made Neil Winters so charismatic, flickered and went out. He blamed the hospital, yes, but more than anyone, he blamed himself. He was the father. He was the protector. He was the one who signed the papers to put Julian in that place. The guilt of a parent is a heavy, suffocating blanket. He kept thinking, if I had kept him home, if I had hired a private nurse, if I had just answered the phone one more time. Kristoff St. continued to show up for work. He continued to memorize his lines for the young and the restless. He continued to smile on the red carpet. But he was a hollow man. He was a walking ghost. The father died in that hospital room with his son. The body just hadn't caught up yet. And as the years ticked by, the pain didn't get better. It got worse. The silence in his house got louder, and Kristoff began to look for an exit. There is a saying that time heals all wounds. That is a lie. For some wounds, time only makes the infection deeper. In the years following Julian's death, Kristoff St. tried to survive. He tried to be strong for his daughters, Paris and Lola. He tried to honor his son's memory by creating a documentary. He tried to advocate for mental health reform, but privately, he was disintegrating. Grief is not a straight line. It is a spiral. And Kristoff was spinning downward faster and faster. In 2017, around the 3-year anniversary of Julian's death, the dam finally broke. The pain became so unbearable that Kristoff sent a photo to his ex-wife, Mia. It wasn't a photo of remembrance. It was a photo of himself holding a gun to his head. Mia, terrified, called the police. They rushed to his home. They found him in a state of absolute despair. They confiscated 2 weapons and placed him on a 5150 hold, a 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold. For a moment, it seemed like history was repeating itself. The father was now the patient. He was released. He went back to work. He apologized to his fans. He said he was okay. But he wasn't. We have to talk about the reality of survivor's guilt. Kristoff didn't just miss his son. He felt guilty for breathing while his son was in the ground. Every sunrise was a reminder that Julian would never see another one. Every moment of joy was tainted by the feeling that he didn't deserve to be happy. To cope, Kristoff turned to the bottle. Alcohol became his anesthesia. It was the only thing that numbed the sharp edges of his memories. But alcohol is a depressant. It feeds the darkness. It doesn't cure it. By January 2019, Kristoff was in bad shape. He checked himself into the UCLA Medical Center for Depression. He was admitted to a mental health hospital in Pasadena. He was trying. He was fighting. He knew he was in trouble. But once again, the system failed him. Just days before his death on February 1st, 2019, he was discharged, released, sent home. Mia St. was furious. She knew he wasn't ready. She later said, "He was suicidal when he went in, and he was suicidal when he left." How could they let a man with a history of gun threats and severe depression walk out the door? After just a few days, Kristoff went home to his empty house in the San Fernando Valley. The Super Bowl was coming up. He had invited a friend over to watch the game. He was trying to act normal. But on the morning of Sunday, February 3rd, the fight ended. He started drinking. Vodka. A lot of it. He was alone with his thoughts, and his thoughts were all about Julian. At around 11 a.m., he called Mia. It was the last time she would ever hear his voice. He was crying. He was incoherent. He was drunk. But through the tears, he said something that was both terrifying and strangely beautiful. He wasn't talking about the past anymore. He was talking about the present. "Mia," he whispered. "Julian is at the door." Mia froze. She tried to tell him, "No, baby." Julian isn't there. Julian is gone. But Kristoff was insistent. He wasn't hallucinating in fear. He was hallucinating in relief. "No, he's right there. He's at the door. He says he wants to take me for a walk." He wanted to go. He was tired. The role of Neil Winters, the role of the strong father, the role of the survivor. He couldn't play them anymore. The credits were rolling. Mia panicked. She called his friend. She told him to get over there immediately. "Break the door down if you have to," she screamed. But by the time the friend arrived, the house was silent. When Kristoff's friend arrived at the house in San Fernando Valley, the dread was palpable. He didn't have a key, so he had to call Kristoff's ex-wife to get permission to force his way in. When he finally entered, the air was heavy with the smell of alcohol. He found Kristoff St. lying on the floor, slumped between the sofa and the coffee table. He looked peaceful, as if he had just fallen asleep. But the silence told a different story. Paramedics arrived. They tried to revive him. But the man who had survived Hollywood, survived a childhood cult, and survived the death of his son, had finally lost his last battle. Kristoff St. was pronounced dead at the age of 52. The autopsy report came back weeks later, and it read like a medical textbook. The official cause of death was hypertrophic heart disease, a condition where the heart muscle becomes abnormally thick, making it harder to pump blood. It is a silent killer, but the report also noted the contributing factor, a lethal amount of alcohol. His blood alcohol level was 4 times the legal limit. In medical terms, his heart simply stopped beating. But in human terms, he died of a broken heart. He drank until the pain stopped. He drank until the memories of the hospital room and the plastic bag faded away. In a heartbreaking twist of irony, investigators found a text message Kristoff had sent to his ex-wife not long before he died. In the text, he was trying to be strong for her. He wrote, "Understand you have to live in the present and observe all the good things in your life. Julian would not want you to live your life with bitterness and upset. It eats away at you. You must rise to the occasion." He could give the advice, but he couldn't take it. He was trying to save her from the very darkness that was consuming him. The funeral was a somber affair, but for those closest to him, there was a strange sense of relief, not because he was gone, but because he was no longer in pain. They buried him at the Valley Oaks Memorial Park in Westlake Village, California. They lowered his casket into the ground right next to the grave of his son, Julian St. In life, they were separated by a cruel disease and a negligent system. In death, they were finally side by side. Mia St. the woman who had fought beside him in the ring of life for decades, found comfort in the only thought that made sense. She remembered that last phone call. She remembered him saying, "Julian is at the door." She doesn't believe it was a hallucination. She believes it was a rescue mission. In her memoir, Fighting for My Life, she wrote that she believes Julian saw his father suffering. He saw that his father's heart was too heavy to carry anymore. So he came back. He knocked on the door of that lonely house in the valley, took his father by the hand, and said, "Come on, Dad. Let's go for a walk." Conclusion. The story of Kristoff St. is a tragedy. Yes, but it is also a testament to the ferocity of a father's love. We often look at celebrities and envy them. We envy the fame, the awards, the money. But Kristoff's life reminds us of a sobering truth. Fame is just a costume. Underneath the Neil Winters suits, underneath the Emmy Awards, was just a man who loved his boy. He spent 27 years entertaining us. He spent 24 years raising a prince. And he spent his final 5 years dying of grief. Rest in peace, Kristoff. Rest in peace, Julian. You are finally home.